IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Before we begin today's podcast, I would like to talk about the Takshashila Institution's Policy School. The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and technology and policy. Application deadline for this September 2022 cohort is 27th August. With that, let us begin our podcast. For the past week, the union government's Agnipath scheme has created much uproar and agony among the people of India. It has drawn some support, while also it has drawn some ire. In this episode, we are going to address the fundamental issues of the Agnipath scheme. We are going to analyze what it is trying to solve. And we will discuss the alternatives to the Agnipath policy, which might help solve the problems faced by the armed forces. To discuss this with me, I have my colleague Pranay Kotasthane and Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon. Welcome, sir, and welcome, Pranay.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by fundamentally talking about what the Agnipath recruitment scheme is trying to solve. We have been given two different narratives. The first is that this is to save the looming problem of defense pensions. And the other is that the army is trying to be more youthful and reduce the average age of the servicemen and women. General Menon, can you tell our listeners what is the fundamental problem that the Agnipath scheme is trying to address?
Yes, actually, the Agnipath scheme is rooted in the issue about a physical problem of the Indian state and the availability of physical resources with other competing demands of the state. So, while this remains the basic problem, it will also try and address the issue of keeping the armed forces as young as possible. While these two remains the basic advantages which the scheme can bring, it is also touted as an opportunity for youth to serve the nation. So that, I think, is how the scheme is being sold. But I would think that without understanding the issues of the defense budget problem and its connection with the pensionary outgo ever since OROP has been introduced, we would not be seeing the problem in the correct perspective.
Thank you, General. Pranay, I would like to move to you. As General Menon mentioned that this is the Agnipath scheme is also connected to the defense pensions and how it's been growing since the introduction of the one rank, one pension scheme. Can you give our listeners the context in which the defense budgets are created and why this is a public finance issue and why should we look at it in a public finance issue?
Yeah, thanks, Pranav. So, as General Menon was saying, it is rooted in the issues related to government finances. And that is something we've seen over a long time. What has happened over the years is that earlier, before 1976, we had something like Agnipath scheme in the sense that people didn't automatically qualify for a pension. They served for up to 10 years and then they went out into doing other things, right? But after 1976, the norm became that people will serve as soldiers in the armed forces for a default of 14 to 15 years, and which automatically qualifies all of them for pensions. So this was the first thing. The second thing, what happened is over time, India's health outcomes improved, longevity increased. So there is also increasing pension outflow for perfectly good reasons and happy reasons that actually all of us are living more, right? So that is the second cause. And then the third one is what General Menon said about OROP, one rank, one pension, where it is a wage index defined benefit scheme where your pension will keep getting reset over the years, even though you would have retired much earlier, but it will be indexed to a person who's going to retire in the future as well, right? So, what it means is your pension will keep increasing. Now, all these three reasons have led to a defense expenditure profile which is heavily skewed towards personnel costs. So we can see that in the defense budget the, numbers over the last decade or so. Over the last decade, if you see, there is a very clear pattern where capital outlay, which includes the money on modernization, etc., has been declining, and you can almost map one to one that the corresponding increase has happened on the pensions front. So if you see over the last decade, the defense expenditure as a whole has increased by around 8.9% year on year, but the pensions expenditure has increased 14 to 15% year on year. So what is happening is that pension expenditure is eating into the modernization spending, eating into even the maintenance spending. So it is that's the big concern, right? And all the issues of this pension have been known from a long time. The Kargil Review Committee also considered it. Then there was a note by the National Security Council Secretariat in 2005, 2006 as well. And then there has been a lot of debate on what should be done about this. And there were lots of solutions, of which the government has finally opted to have a short service sort of contract or short service hiring of soldiers for a period, and then they are sent off with a generous package after 4 year terms, which is known as the Agnipath scheme. So that's how I would put it.
Yeah, thanks, Pranay. What I find very interesting is that of all the alternatives, the government has chosen this, where on average there'll be 46,000 new recruits after 4 years, out of whom 25% will be retained. General Menon, we know that the armed forces requires a lot of training and skill, and a good fighting force comes from good training over the years. One of the arguments that's been made against the Agnipath scheme is that having taken soldiers for a period of 4 years and then letting most of them go, particularly in the Navy and the Air Force, will create a problem where you are letting go of the talent that you have spent so much time training, and you will have to retrain a new crew where you will have only a small number of highly trained soldiers, but over the years you will have a batch of soldiers whom you will have to retrain. Is this argument valid, or in your perspective, do you think that it is actually a human resource problem that can be well managed?
Well, I think the 4 year tenure has been decided to make sure that any further increase would have involved payout of gratuity and come under the labor law. So that is why the 4 years was decided. And I would think that 4 years is too little and should have been, in my view, to meet the requirement of the keeping military effectiveness in good health, should have been extended to 5 to 7 years. But then that would have definitely attracted the payout of gratuity and so on. So, in my view, unless it is connected to a flow into other attractive positions within the government of India itself, it would be difficult to both have no payout of gratuity, that means stay under 4 years, and yet maintain military effectiveness. If you have to maintain military effectiveness, it has to be about 5 to 7 years, and that means you cannot be about just getting people for 4 years and letting them out. So I think there is a contradiction here which needs to be resolved.
Okay, but there are also other criticisms, General. For example, one of the Agnipath scheme also has something called All India All Rank Recruitment. traditionally within the armed forces, soldiers are placed in regiments and ranks which are closely aligned with their geography and with their social composition. With an all India all rank scheme, is there a potential or unintended consequences where you are trying to where we will see this friction that's created among the soldiers themselves? Or is this also an issue that is overblown and it can be managed in reality?
No, in fact, I would disagree with that point of view because most of the units of the Indian Army, especially Air Force and Navy, in any case, are all India class. It is only the in combat units like the infantry regiments and in some armored regiments. And this is a legacy issue of the British Indian Army. And I think it was it is high time that we shifted all the units gradually through a managed process to an all India class unit. In fact, I belong to a regiment, the Brigade of the Guards, which was raised by Field Marshal Cariappa as an all India class regiment. And I would think that our regiment itself has proved that all India class regiments are as good, if not better, than those which actually have identities like the Mahad regiment or the Punjab regiment or the Sikh regiment. In fact, after the mutiny took place post Operation Blue Star, there was a study which was ordered to convert all these regiments into all India class. But even then, the diehards refused to budge, and we have not been able to trans transit from regiments based on religion or region or caste to an all India classes. So this, if it's a very good idea in my point of view, and there would be no problem. The question is, how do you manage the change? But that's not something which is not insurmountable.
Thank you, Jen Menon. I didn't know this. It's very surprising. It's very interesting for me because this was already tried and tested, as you said, in your own unit as a pilot program, which is proven to work. So we know that when some of these initiatives are taken in a smaller scale, you can see the success, you can see what works and what doesn't. That is something that could have been implemented with the Agnipath scheme itself. I want to come back to you again. We know that the government has said that at some point after 14 years, we will start seeing the change in how the defense expenditure is spread out. Do you think, given the unintended consequences this may have, for example, it reduces the opportunity cost for defense modernization, for restructuring of the organization, and so on? Will there be an actual saving in 4 years, or will the burden of defense pension actually come down where we can use the savings to look at other aspects of defense? Or do you think this is a cause that's too big to solve by one policy?
So, an important point, I think one thing we should realize is no pension reforms can solve today's problem or yesterday's problem. All pension reforms can only solve a future problem or a problem from getting worse in the future. So because, for instance, the only way to reduce pension of the people who pension expenditure now is to either reduce the number of pensioners or reduce the pension that they are already getting, which would be a sovereign promises violation, right? So you don't want any state to do that. Definitely, the Indian state is way more resourceful to be able to even doing something like this, right? So you can't solve the pension problem of today or whatever has already been committed. Only what you can do is in the future, the people who you are recruiting now, when they retire, you can try to alter their pension schemes, etc. Right? And that was done in the NPS in 2004 as well, where they said that people who are going to join from 2004 will be on a different pension scheme where they are going to contribute partly for their own pension corpus, whereas the people who had joined even one day before that continue to be on the old scheme, right? This is how you have to do political management across countries, right? You can't go back on a promise. So even this is the same in this case. The people who have already been recruited, their pensions can't be affected. It shouldn't be affected. So what is the reform is trying to do is the people who are recruited now through this Agniveer scheme, they will not get pension, gratuity, etc. Right? So what will happen now is if instead of Agniveers you would have had regular recruitment, those people would have retired 15 years from now, starting around that time. Those pensions which would have outflown at that time won't be required to be paid because of the reform that has been done now. Right? So, in effect, the government will be able to have money in its the defense budget, etc. 15 years from now. That is the money it is saving. So there is a lot of talk that suddenly now money is available for modernization and all. That's not the case. The modernization, etc. funding will be actually accrue. It will start accruing only 15 years from now, right? But what, as I said, all pension reforms are like that. You can't solve today's problem, you have to look at the future. So to the extent that today's deficit is actually tomorrow's taxes, similarly today's reforms are actually tomorrow's savings. Yeah. So that is what the government is trying to do, and we've done, General Menon and I have tried to estimate it using very rough calculations because a lot of this data is not available. But what we know is very approximately the pension outflow for each soldier, the lifetime pension outflow is around a crore, or actually even more than that, but it's a conservative estimate. So if this year's intake of Agniveer is 46,000, and out of that 11,500, that is 25%, continue to serve, the money that you will save is on the remaining 34,500 people. So in effect, you are saving a net present value of 34,500 crores, but this money, as I said, will accrue only 15 years from now.
Thanks, Pranay. So we have to be patient, and we also have to think about we don't have to wait for 15 years for us to make these savings, because modernization will have to also continue. So this would be a challenge again about how the government will deal with satisfying existing pensions demands as well as the demand for modernization, as we have external threats to address also, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. This is just one part. None of these solutions can solve the entire problem. And like you rightly said, there are lots of other things which need to be done. There also needs to be more efficient utilization of current resources. There is talk of theaterization, etc. So there is a whole gamut of solutions which are required. And just by doing this, it's not as if we'll have money available for modernization tomorrow. That's not what this will achieve.
Yeah, thank you, Pranay. You mentioned the gamut of solutions, and that brings me to the final part of the podcast, which I really want to talk about. We have seen a lot of debate around the Agnipath itself, but very few alternatives that have been laid down, or alternative ways that the Agnipath scheme can be implemented. Jen Menon, your most recent most recent piece in the print said that the Agnipath scheme, to really be of effectiveness, it has to tap into the human potential. Could you elaborate on that and tell our listeners what is a way that we can make the scheme actually successful and help it meet its objectives?
So I think we have to see it in the context of the the scale of unemployment at the moment which India is experiencing. And with that perspective, the idea would be that the armed forces should be able to attract within its ranks, leadership, of course, highly qualified and motivated people who are young. And if that is so, I do not think that you would be able to do this without assuring lifelong employment and a pension which follows. Without these two things in the basket, the people who join or will there, and I'm sure there will be still, the rallies will be full, there'll be enough people to join. We would not be leveraging the human capital which is actually available because the scheme is not attractive enough. And these two things has to be fulfilled. And the way to do it is what we had already worked out between Pranay and me, is actually connect the flow of the people who serve in the army to the other parts of government, especially with those parts of the MHA, like the CAPFs, and even the state police forces, because of the commonalities of the skill sets which are required in the next job and across government. So, if this scheme has to succeed, it is not only the MHA which will play a major part, but all parts of government should be open to assure, and that's where the catch is, because nobody trusts the government to say that you serve for 4 years and we'll give you some quota in a particular organization, and that quota will be subject to a whole lot of rules and regulations, and they're not sure that whether they're going to have another job after spending 4 years with government. So psychologically, unless we rectify this discontinuity in the employment spectrum, I do not think we can attract the best which the country can offer. And the armed forces requires that best.
Yeah, certainly. There should always be an incentive for the youth of the country to join the armed forces and be guaranteed, assured that their careers are secure even within the army or even outside the army in some sense. Thank you, General. I urge the listeners to read the op-ed, which we will place in the show notes. Pranay, do you have any alternatives that you've thought of?
I will just add to what General Menon said, that the model that we sort of tried to operationalize, again, it already has been discussed in NSCS, etc., and we tried to work it out in terms of more details, etc., and we called it human capital investment model, right? And the reason was that we have this strange situation where there are lots of people who are trained well in the armed forces, but there are also other parts of the national security system which are severely understaffed and which don't have the expertise that is already there in another part of the national security system, which is our armed forces. So the idea was, can we connect these two parts and can we invest in the human capital that already exists in silos? And that's why this idea of moving people across the national security system was proposed. So there have been versions of this. One idea earlier was just that people who are already serving in the armed forces move to these paramilitary forces or police forces through lateral induction. Now, that has not worked for various reasons, because the people who retire after 15 years in the armed forces don't find that option lucrative enough, or their service, the ranks that they get, the pay that they get is not commensurate with their capabilities and their expectations. So that has sort of not worked. That's why we propose an inverse induction model where the CAPFs actually recruit the people who serve in the armed forces for 7, 8 years and then return back to their parent recruiting organizations, which is CAPFs, etc. Right? So that way, you also build the capacity of the entire national security system. So that was we call it the inverse induction model, and that is one of the other solutions which has been talked about. The third solution is to move the armed forces to also the national pension system or new pension scheme, like the civilians have already moved in the armed forces and also in the government in general. But that again is politically infeasible because of the OROP, but that is one of the solutions which has been talked about. So if you look at it, these are like the broad four solutions: Agnipath, then inverse induction, lateral induction, and finally moving people to NPS. All of these solutions have their own trade-offs. There is no perfect solution. These are all second best alternatives to a problem. And I guess the government has already chosen one of these options. So I guess what General Menon said about trying to ensure that these people can be utilized in the entire national security system, and then after retirement they get an NPS pay, pension, etc. That might be a good solution to make this system work. I would also add what Nitin had written in another op-ed recently, that the key is also to have a good enough exit package for people who have already joined in, so that after continuation of 4 years they are actually able to do something else in their life successfully, transition smoothly into a career outside armed forces. So focusing on the exit pathway of all the people who are recruited is really crucial to make this scheme work in the long run.
Thank you, Pranay. You've certainly provided a lot more solutions than we have seen written largely in the public domain. This conversation has certainly helped me learn a lot more about the Agnipath scheme and the alternatives and the core issues that we're going to solve. And I'm sure that has also helped listeners understand the problem better. Thank you, General Menon, and thank you, Pranay, for joining me on this episode. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey. Hello, everybody. It's been another awesome, great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Think Fast, Varun and Sujita talk about India's new unicorn, PhysicsWala, and their humble business venture. On Nankari, Sadaf and Archit discover some interesting trivia about oil with Hindustan Times columnist Shweta Sivakumar. On Misconduct, Ragvi and Nisha tell us about sex trafficker Sonu Punjaban. On Big Talk about tiny humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna shared tips for sleep training babies. And on Ikka Dukka Economy, renowned economist Arun Kumar tells Abhinav about the impact of black money on individual finances. We got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has just launched its merch line and you should check it out now. Head over to the IVM Podcast website, that's ivmpodcast.com, and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Also, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. That really does help. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And also do remember, you can check out a number of our shows on YouTube. You can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to get a list of the channels that we are keeping active. We also are doing a small listener survey. If you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey to fill this out, it'll just take a few minutes and it really helps us out. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Apne Liye, Apno Ke Liye. Jupiter, a digital banking app. Capgemini, get the future you want. Intel vPro, built for business. And Intel, future banana wonderful with Intel-powered laptops.